So I'd like to begin by wishing everyone a good morning, good afternoon, or good whatever time of day it happens to be for you where you are. And we will begin as usual with the prayers for going for refuge and rousing bodhicitta. So I'd like to ask you to please I'd like to ask you to all to please recite these prayers with great faith and devotion in the three jewels and the gurus and so forth. So let me get this up. O sanje chedan soge chonam la chancho bardo dane chapsum che dagi chenyen gibe senam ji drola penjer sanje drobar sho sanje chedan soge chonam la chancho bardo dane chapsum che dagi chenyen gibe senam ji Dola penjir sanje drobar sho sanje chedan soge chonam la chancho barado dane chapsum je dagi chenyen gibe sunam je Dola penjir sanje drobar sho until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Semjen tamje dewa dan dewe judan dembar jurjik donga dan donga ji judan rawar jurjik donga mebe dewa tamba tam mindrawa jurjik Nirin shadan nitan rawe tanyon shembola ne bar jurjik. The Dharma Expanse Palace of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas, the 3 times who shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted gurus. Please bless me and all sentient beings throughout space so that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us so that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us so that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us so that confusion arise as wisdom. And now please think to yourselves that we must bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings, as limitless as space, to the state of lasting happiness. And that state of lasting happiness is Buddhahood. That's the only state where happiness is not going to perish or decline or uh, gradually leave us before we realize it's gone. And so we need to bring all sentient beings to that state. And so think to yourselves that we are listening to these teachings with this motivation of bodhicitta today. And the Dharma that we are listening to is the Treasury of Abhidharma by Vasubandhu, as explained by the ninth Karmapa Wangchuk Dorje in his commentary Youthful Play, of the 8 chapters of the Treasury of Abhidharma, or the 8 areas as they're called in the text actually. We were discussing the 8th area, the teachings on absorption. So this has 3 parts, well actually 2 main parts. First is the explanation of the branch that, there's the text of the area, and then there's the explanation of the branch that completes the composition, the summary of the treatise. So right now we're speaking about the main text of the chapter. At the end of the main text of the chapter, there is a section that completes the treatise, the conclusion to the entire treatise. This text of the chapter has 3 main parts: an explanation of the dhyanas and formless, classifications of samadhi, and an explanation of the qualities supported by samadhi. So basically we're talking about the different types of samadhi, the different types of meditation, and in describing these, we start with the dhyanas and the formless meditations that we have already mentioned many times over the course of these of all 3 years of the teachings. It comes to these texts, the dhyanas and the formless are mentioned all throughout the text. They're also mentioned in many other texts. When we talk about the like in the path of the Mahayana, and we talk about the dhyanas and the formless there. The 5th paramita is the paramita of dhyana. And so these are important things. It's important for us to understand what is meant by these terms in the sutra tradition. Even if in the Vajrayana our practice is different, these are very important in the sutra tradition. So we need to understand what is actually being referred to when we say dhyana. So the explanation of the dhyanas and the formless has 2 topics: the individual explanations and understanding them in common. And we are in the section on understanding them in common. And that has 6 different topics: examining their essence, identifying the branches of dhyana, the manner in which the absorptions are attained, what support manifests them, and what sphere they focus on, and identifying what discards affliction. So these are the 6 different parts of the treatise. So we are speaking about, we've been through the example of examining their essence. In other words, whether they are virtuous, afflicted, or undefiled. What is the essence of these? Or neutral. So what are they? So we spoke about them yesterday, the 3 types that are concurrent with enjoyment, pure, and undefiled. So concurrent with enjoyment means that there's craving. You are enjoying your meditation and getting attached to it. And this is a problem that I think often comes up for meditators. And when you start enjoying your meditation, you're kind of off your meditation, because you're no longer thinking about you're no longer focusing on what you're supposed to focus on. Instead, thinking, wow, this feels so good, which is what? It's not the meditation, right? So that's the first section. That's the first one, the concurrent with enjoyment. Then there's the pure. So pure means virtuous but defiled. Because remember, we can have worldly dhyana meditations, and we can have the transcendent, or what do we say? The transcendent or undefiled. So the pure means the worldly virtue, defiled virtue. And then we have the undefiled, which is only noble beings has that. So the pure and the afflicted can be had by noble and ordinary beings, but only noble beings have the undefiled. So that is what we discussed yesterday. And so today we've come to the topic of the branches of dhyana. And so to discuss this, we are resuming in the text, and the headings, the topic listings, are on the bottom of page 550 in the book. So here is the text. So we're in the middle of this screen. Identifying the branches of dhyana. And this has three topics. Correlating the branches to each absorption, teaching three branches in particular, and teaching the distinctions among the absorptions. So we're talking about the branches of dhyana. And so before we get into this, basically what we're talking about with branches of dhyana, these are like different qualities that you have in each of the different levels of dhyana meditation. And they're really important as because they're kind of what allow you to meditate, they're what encourage you to meditate, the benefits of the meditation, and basically the nature of the meditation itself. So in the dhyanas, almost all of the discussions of the dhyanas talk about the branches of the dhyanas, the different aspects that you need. And this is the same in any tradition that talks about the dhyanas. So when we want to talk about them, so we begin with correlating the branches to each absorption, and this has 2 points. So basically correlating the branches to each absorption, saying which absorption, which level of dhyana has which branches. So this has 2 points, classifying in terms of name. And the second is summarizing in terms of substance. So classifying in terms of name says the text reads, the first has 5. So the first dhyana has 5 branches: considering, examining, joy, pleasure, and samadhi. These are the 5 on the first. There are 4 branches on the second. So 5 on the first and then 4 on the second. So the 4 on the second are serenity, joy, and so forth. So forth meaning where am I? The serenity and joy and pleasure and one-pointedness itself. So you've got a feeling of pleasure and then the one-pointed feeling of samadhi. Then 5 on the third, there's equanimity, mindfulness, awareness, pleasure, and then rest. Rest here means samadhi because you're resting, you're staying in samadhi. The last has 4. The fourth dhyana has 4 branches: mindfulness, mindful equanimous, not pain or pleasure, and samadhi. So the fourth has 4 branches. Mindfulness is one, equanimity. So equanimity here means the mental factor of equanimity. It's one of the aggregate of formations. Neither pain nor pleasure means a neutral feeling. And I think one of the reasons, sometimes there's a little, well, I'm not going to go there. Just neither pain nor pleasure means a neutral feeling. And then samadhi. So that's the 4th. So all of them have this factor of samadhi, but they're differentiated by their other factors. In general, it's like we spoke about yesterday. We went through the verse that talked about them having examining joy and pleasure, and eliminating each of these in order as you go through the higher realms. Well, this is presenting it in more specific, exactly what ones you have. So the first dhyana has 5 branches. And so what are these 5 branches? The first is that because it's because of abandoning such impediments as desire of the desire realm, the malice and hostility, and so on, there are the 2 antidotal branches of considering and examining. So considering and examining, these are similar in that you're kind of focusing on things, but they're a little bit different in how they apply. So considering, and Vasubandhu describes it in the second chapter, is considering and examining are coarse and fine. So considering is coarse. You've got this factor that's kind of looking at things on a gross level. It's not getting into details. And examining is looking at things finely on the fine level. What exactly is it? How does it work? Looking at it really carefully. So you have to have the considering in order to have the examining. It also can be talked about in other ways. In the Theravada tradition, they have some nice, what do we say, comparisons for them. So they have, what they say here is considering. Actually, they're using the Pali word vitaka. Considering, or vitaka, is like a bird spreading out its wings, while vichara, that is examining, is like a bird gliding through the air with outstretched wings. So, one is like getting ready and the other is doing. Vitaka, considering, is like a bee diving towards its flower, while vichara is like the bee buzzing above the flower. So in other words, the vitaka, the considering, is like getting ready, just going in for that flower, and then the bee sees a flower, they come in, and they get there, and then they want to look at it. They want to see, well, where is that nectar? And so they buzz around above it before they land, and then sip the nectar. When you have a dirty dish, I'm going to just do this one as a, what do we say? I'm not going to read their text. You've got a tarnished plate, a metal plate that's tarnished. You want to polish it. You have one hand that's holding it and one hand that's polishing, right? The hand that's holding it is like the considering, and the polishing hand is like the examination. So those are kind of the different functions as described in the Theravada Abhidharma tradition. So those are so that's those two. And their function is to abandon doubt and malice and so forth. Here in the Theravada tradition, they add doubt. Here Wangchuk Dorje says desire of the desire, attachment to the desire, malice and hostility and so forth. And the reason they talk about doubt in the Theravada is that when you have the quality of examining, at that moment, you might not have necessarily uprooted doubt entirely if you haven't already gone through the path of seeing. But at the moment that you have it, it inhibits it. It prevents it from arising at that moment. So considering and examining remove the impediments. And so then at that time, so as it says in the commentary, having discarded the impediments through considering and examining, there is joy and pleasure born of withdrawal. This is not withdrawal as in withdrawal from an addiction. Maybe it is. It's like withdrawal from addiction to the desire realm. But unlike withdrawal from cigarettes or other drugs, this is one that's actually pleasurable. So there are two factors, joy and pleasure. There's a lot to say about joy and pleasure, but it's one of the main topics that we're going to get to in a little while. So I'm not going to go through it twice. We've already spoken about it a little bit, and those of you who have studied the second chapter have already heard a bit about this as well. And so those are the branches of benefit. So these former ones, in other words, the first four, the considering, examining, joy, and pleasure, are accomplished through the power of one-pointedness. So there's a supporting branch of samadhi. It's like the basis. It's a support or the basis. So here, actually, the dhyana itself is samadhi, right, as we discussed the other day. But it is also a branch. So it's considered a branch, it's considered a samadhi. As Wangchuk Dorje says, samadhi is both a branch and also dhyana. The others are only branches, it is heard. So the dhyana of 5 branches is just like an army with 4 branches. So the considering, examining, joy, and pleasure are branches, but they're not the actual dhyana. But they're really important because they're the way that you maintain and keep it's like when you keep your dhyana going. They're the qualities that you enjoy while you're in the dhyana. So it's sort of like when you have an army, you have to have, if you were in ancient India, you have your elephants, chariots, cavalry, and infantry. And, you need all 4 in order to win the battle. Similarly, if you're going to be practicing the first dhyana, you need all 5 of these branches. So that's the first dhyana, these 5 branches of considering, examining, joy, pleasure, and samadhi. So then there are 4 branches on the second dhyana. The antidotal branch that abandons the impediments of considering and examining, which is true inner serenity. Now, actually, this is the word serenity. It could also be like real clarity, true clarity or purity, really lucid, limpid quality of this. It's a very, so some places translated as serenity. Now, I can't remember where I saw, I know that when I translated the text, I took this word from another treatise, but I can't remember which one I got it from. If you look at the Ian Cochran text, he translates it as, what does he say? Clear purity. Or, so it's basically something that's like really pure, really serene. It's not stirred up. And then there are the branches of benefit and support, joy and so forth, including joy, pleasure, and one-pointedness or samadhi itself. So on the second branches, you have the serenity. Now, the reason it's serenity is like when you have the considering and examining, you're working. So it's kind of stirring things up a little bit. And then when you get abandon those and get to the second dhyana, you then don't have that stirring up, and so things become very clean, pure, serene. And so that is how you have the serenity. And then the other three branches of joy and pleasure, those two are the branches of benefit, and one-pointedness or samadhi is the branch of support. So that's the second dhyana. Then in the third dhyana, we have 5 branches. And the 3 branches have 3 antidotal branches that discard the impediment of the lower levels of joy. Also, the first is the formation equanimity, which by not striving for joy has the characteristic of spontaneity in relation to the focus. And so it's basically remaining right there. It's not like attached to it or anything. It's not doesn't have the quality of joy. It's just remaining right there, fresh with the focus. And mindfulness, which does not forget the continuum of equanimity. That looks to be a typo. I'm going to make a note of that. Okay. And awareness, which does not forget mindfulness. So you have the equanimity, which is basically, it's like the mental factor in the aggregate of formations of equanimity. So it's sort of seeing everything equally, viewing everything equally. And then you want to maintain that equanimity, so you need mindfulness. Mindfulness means basically remembering. Actually, the Sanskrit and the Tibetan words mean memory, remembering. What are you remembering? You're remembering what you need to be doing. You need to remain equanimous. And then here, awareness, which does not forget mindfulness. It's basically, so you've got this double, the way it's presented here, the awareness and the mindfulness are like 2 different layers of not forgetting, kind of keeping you there. One, remember, is that you need to keep on the equanimity, that's mindfulness. And then the second, the awareness, means you're remembering that you need to keep mindful. And so those are the branches of mindfulness and awareness. Now, of course, mindfulness and awareness are used with somewhat different meanings in many different traditions, many different Buddhist traditions. It's explained differently. So I don't think we need to go into that right now. Let's continue with dhyana. We'll just continue with the text instead of digressing too much at the moment. The branches of benefit and support are respectively pleasure, and then the samadhi of a mind that rests. So as I said while we were going through the root, in the root it says rests, but what it means is samadhi, staying. So those are the 5 branches of the third dhyana, and so now we've come to the last, or fourth dhyana, which has 4 branches. The first is completely pure mindfulness. And then the second is a formation equanimity that is free of the 8 faults of lower levels. These 8 faults are like considering and examining and joy and so forth. And the neutral feeling that is not pain or pleasure, neither pain nor pleasure, and completely pure samadhi. So this is really the purest of these 4, because the first 3 dhyanas each have their own defects. In the first, it's not defects so much as they're not, compared to the fourth dhyana, they're defects. For each dhyana, of course, they're necessary. If you're on the first dhyana, you need your consideration and analysis. The second dhyana, you need your joy. It's necessary for that dhyana. And on the third dhyana, you have to have that faculty of pleasure. But they're in the fourth dhyana, they're not entirely stable. And so in the fourth dhyana, you eliminate these through successively, so that by the time you're on the fourth jhana, you don't have any of these faults of samadhi. So this is why it's the supreme of the easy paths, as we described before, as it doesn't have any of the different faults of the other types of dhyana. So these are the 18 branches, and so in terms of their names, the branches of dhyana are 18, because the first and third have 5 branches each, and the second and fourth have 4. So the first and third have 5 branches, so that's 10, and the second and fourth have 8 each, have 4, so that's 2 twice 4 is 8. That plus 10 is 18. So that's how we get 18 in terms of their names. But that's in terms of their names. However, some of the branches are kind of, what do we say? They're repeated from one dhyana to another. And so because they're repeated from one dhyana to another, in terms of substance, there are only 11. So it's, as it says here, summarizing in terms of substance. So in substance, they are 11. In other words, what we're saying is if we look at these 18 different names, these list of 18 branches of dhyana, we'll see that actually they are only 11 mental factors. Oh, that's what it means. So in substance, they are 11. The first dhyana has 5 substances. That's easy because they're all 5 there. You've got your considering and examining, joy, pleasure, and samadhi. And each of those is a mental factor, although it gets a little bit unclear what do we mean by each. The second dhyana's true inner serenity, and the third's equanimity and mindfulness and awareness and pleasure make 10. So on the second level, you've got a new one. That's that serenity, that inner serenity or that inner purity. And then the third has equanimity, mindfulness, and awareness, and that makes up 10. On the fourth dhyana, you've got a new factor, the neutral feeling. That makes 11. So in this reason, so then it says, for that reason, there are 4 alternatives of branches that are on the first dhyana that are but not on the second, and so forth. So as I think I've mentioned before, in the Indian tradition, we often talk about 4 alternatives. And so what do we mean by these 4 alternatives? Well, this is kind of a way to evaluate kind of how well you understand the things. It's like talking, it's like in Western teachings, we use Venn diagrams. Or actually, I don't use Venn diagrams. I only learned about Venn diagrams when I was trying to figure out how do you translate mushi, the Tibetan mushi, into English? What does it mean? It's like 4 alternatives, but what does it mean? Well, it's like a Venn diagram where you have like overlapping circles that show overlapping sets of things. So you have things, so you have branches that are on one but not on the other. You have some that are on multiple branches. For example, samadhi is on all 4 branches, right? So you can evaluate. And this is the reason for doing this is partially to just kind of understand and make sure that you understand the differences between the two. For like if we take the first jhana and the second jhana, well, what do we have on the first jhana? On the first jhana, we have the considering, examination, joy, pleasure, and samadhi. Well, so which of these are only on the first jhana and not on the second jhana? Well, the second jhana has what? It has the serenity, joy, pleasure, and samadhi, right? So on the first jhana, you're considering and examining, and they're not on the second jhana. So that's like that's one alternative, the ones that are only on the first jhana, but not on the second. So then are there any that are on the second dhyana that are not on the first? Well, what are the 4 in the second dhyana? You've got serenity, joy, pleasure, and samadhi, those 4. Well, of them, joy, pleasure, and samadhi are all on the first, but that leaves us one, the serenity. So that's on the first, but that's on the second, but not on the first. And then that means that we have 3 that are not on the first jhana, or these that are on both the first jhana and the second jhana. These are the pleasure, joy, and samadhi. And so that's the both. And then you have those things that are on neither of the samadhi. And when you've had training in debate and you are doing these four alternatives, the first thing that you learn to blurt out when you see the alternative of neither first jhana or second jhana, you know that the first thing you just blurt out is the word jugs, because jugs are not on the first jhana and they're not on the second jhana. They're not branches of either jhana. But if you want to do something that's actually a little bit more meaningful, you can also think about in terms of the other factors. Prajna. It's on both of the jhanas, but is not a branch of either one, and so forth, right? So you've got these different ways of thinking about it. So the reason for doing this is to just kind of, see how you understand the intersections or the overlapping, the overlap between the different jhanas. I mean, you could even do them not necessarily between adjacent jhanas, because you could do like the first and the fourth jhana. What's only on the first jhana? Well, the first four on the first jhana. And what's the considering, examining, joy, and pleasure? They're not on the fourth jhana. On the fourth jhana, you have, you've got a neutral feeling and so forth that are not on the first jhana, and you've got samadhi that's on both, and then you have jugs that are neither the first nor the fourth jhana. So those are the four alternatives here. So let's return to the text here. So now there are some of these branches that are actually, the words, the names of these branches come up in the sutras, but there's a lot of debate about what they actually are. And they're kind of problems. So in the sutras, it says that there is pleasure, joy, and pleasure and joy on the first two jhanas. Well, what's the difference between them? Then we talk about pleasure on the third jhana. What is that? How can they be? Because part of the problem here is that when you're talking about pleasure, are you talking about physical pleasure or mental pleasure? Well, if you're talking about if you're talking about mental pleasure, then what's the difference between that and joy? How do you differentiate between the two? If it is physical pleasure, if it's pleasure of the body, how can that happen when you are in the equipoise of the jhanas? Because in the equipoise of the jhanas, you do not have any sensory faculties, so you can't have any physical pleasure. The sensory faculties do not operate when you're in jhana. So how do you explain this? And the different Buddhist traditions have different ways of explaining that. So this is the issue. So to go into it, it says teaching the three branches in particular. We've got three that we need to talk about: the branches of pleasure, and joy, and the branch of serenity. So pleasure, it says examining the distinctions in pleasure. Pleasure on the first two is pliancy. So pliancy is also one of the branches of the fourth jhana. But it's just a general mental factor. Pliancy means workability, like you can work with your body and your mind. They'll kind of do what you want them to do. It's not like with your body, if you're pliable, you can just sit as long. If your body is pliable, you can just basically sit comfortably as long as you want. If your mind is pliable, it'll kind of rest as long as you want. That's what we mean by pliability. It means, in Tibetan, the word is shintu jangpa, which means like thoroughly trained, literally. So it's kind of like workability or pliancy are the two words that we most frequently use for this in English. So here the question is, on the first jhana we have pleasure and joy. On the second jhana we have those two, and on the third jhana we have just pleasure. So what is the difference between all of these? And why is that pleasure on the third jhana said to be a different substance than the pleasure of the first two jhanas? So, what is called the branch of pleasure on the first two jhanas is not actually pleasure, but instead it is pliancy. It is not a feeling. So you have sensations or feelings, but they're saying that here it is not a feeling. The pleasure on the third is the feeling of pleasure, and so it is logical to say that it is a different substance than the pleasure of the first two levels. So there's a different quality about that. Now, in the second chapter, it's described how on the first and second levels of form, there is physical. And the levels in the form realm, there are, when you're not in equanimity, then you can have the form realm sensory consciousnesses. When you're in equipoise, you cannot have them. But when you are in post meditation, you can on the first and second dhyana, and in those you can have feelings of physical pleasure. When you're in, so there is pleasure on the first and second dhyanas. But there's also pleasure on the third dhyana, and that's different. And that's what we called, in the second chapter, it's what we called cognitive pleasure. I believe we came across this term earlier in this year's course as well. So you've kind of got different things that are called pleasure. But when we're talking about the pleasure in the first two dhyanas, that is when you are actually in the meditation state, because the sensory faculties do not operate, and there are no sensory consciousnesses in the deep within the dhyana states, therefore it cannot be physical pleasure of any of the different senses, whether eye, ear, body, eye, nose, tongue, body, or causal. I'm missing one. Ear consciousness. It can't be any of these five, pleasure of any of these five. So it has to be something else. So what they basically, there's a lot of debate about this in the texts, and to go through the debate, it's summarized very well in Ian Cochrane's Ornament of the Chim Abhidharma, translated by Ian Cochrane, written by Chim Jambayang. So there's a good description of it there. There's a little bit more detail if you go through it in the Yashomitra commentary. But basically, when we're talking about saying that what is called pleasure on the first two jhanas is pliancy, what we're saying is that your body is just really, really well trained. You aren't going to get sore knees while you're meditating on the jhanas. Your body is just completely well trained. You're not going to have any of the physical discomforts that come up in meditation. So that basically, it's not an actual sensation in the body, but instead it's that quality of pliancy that then, that it's still there. It's a different mental factor. And so that is what we call pleasure in the Great Exposition teaching. So if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because when your body is comfortable, everything is comfortable, right? It's just kind of like everything. So for us in the desire realm, there of course is physical pleasure involved with being comfortable. But even in the jhanas, where there's not that physical pleasure, there is still that quality of pliancy. So here's the reason. And then the commentary, the pleasure of those two levels is not the feeling of pleasure, because the dhyanas of absorption block the sense consciousnesses. In other words, when you're in the absorptions, the sensory consciousnesses do not function. It is not bodily pleasure. So here actually, there's a few years ago, I read about this, and it's one of those things that you read about online someplace and kind of keep in your mind as an interesting factoid, but forget what the source was. And maybe I'm going to mix it up a little bit. But there was a study that was done a few years ago by some neuroscientists, and I don't remember which ones. I probably should have done a search for it this morning online, but I didn't. So the study was like this. They wanted to find out the effects of auditory stimuli on meditators. And so they got experienced meditators from the Theravada, the Zen, and I think the Dzogchen tradition in Tibet, as well as ordinary people. And they did a test. They rigged them up to all sorts of sensors, the way neurosciences do. You can remember, the famous pictures of all these people wearing all sorts of dots on their head and wires coming out of their head. That's what they did with these meditators. They told them, and with the regular people, and they told them to just sit still sit in meditation for some period of time. And during that period of time, they then played the loud sound of a gunshot, like 3 or 4 times during the course of the period. I don't remember the exact number, but they did it several times. So when the ordinary person heard it, then the first time the ordinary person heard the noise, there was like a huge reaction. They could see, you know, all the neurons were firing and this huge reaction in the brain. And the second time, it was a little bit less. And the third time, even less. And the fourth time, and after that, it might have been, I don't remember how many times it was, but basically it tailed off. So that was the regular meditator, or the regular person, not meditating. Then they took the Theravada meditator, and the Theravada meditator entered the dhyana states. One of the dhyanas, and I don't remember which of the dhyanas was, but it doesn't matter because they all block the sensory consciousness. So the meditator was sitting there. They saw that he or she had gone into a really deep meditative state, and then the scientist did the gunshot sound. No reaction. Absolutely none. No change on their brain scans. Then a little while later, they did another gunshot sound. No reaction at all. The third and the fourth, however many gunshots they did, no reactions during the entire time. So it's like the meditator just like absolutely, the sensory consciousness were not functioning. So that's what we mean. You withdraw from the senses and you're entirely mental situation. So it's like pulling inward, withdrawing from the world of pleasure, from the world of desire, and coming in from the sensory consciousness. So it's a very, very deep state of meditation. Then for the Zen and the Dzogchen meditators, they had the exact same thing. For both the Zen and the Dzogchen meditators, they were sitting there in their meditation, and they played the shot, and everything fired off exactly as it had for the first shot for the regular person. And then they did the second shot at some random interval, and then exactly the same, they had the exact same reaction as they'd had the first time. No matter how many gunshots they played, the Zen and the Dzogchen meditators didn't have any decrease in the amount of activity. In other words, their actions, their sensory faculty, their sensory consciousness were fully operation, and they weren't expecting anything, and they weren't thinking, oh, there's that gunshot again. It's just like reacting to everything as it happened. So this is a very different, so like the ordinary person, you know, the reactions get smaller and smaller. There we're just full on the whole time. And the Theravada is like just no reaction at all. So those are, that was kind of like, and the point of saying this is to say that, just to say that basically this is an example of how, what do we say? The neuroscience doing their various scientific things, they actually come and confirm things that are taught in the scriptures. Like when you are doing the dhyanas, your sensory faculties are not functioning. So that's why the faculty of pleasure cannot be bodily pleasure. So if it's not bodily pleasure, but it's pleasure, then it must be mental pleasure, you think. But it's not, as it says here in the last line. Joy is taught as a branch, and that is mental pleasure, which cannot arise simultaneously with cognitive pleasure, the Great Exposition proposes. So the cognitive pleasure is the pleasure of the third dhyana. So on the first, so the joy is mental pleasure, and it's a little bit different in quality than the pleasure on the third dhyana. So basically, what they're saying is that you've got joy is one of the branches, and then you've got the pleasure that is actually pliancy. In other words, just then being able to be really comfortable in your body and be able to let your body will do what you want. That's the pleasure, and then you've got the joy. So those are the difference between the joy and pleasure. Then you've got cognitive pleasure on the third, which is not the same as joy. It's a different factor. And so then in the Great Exposition, they call it that cognitive pleasure, the Great Exposition proposes. But not every school accepts that. And in particular here, Vasubandhu, in fact, the Theravada school has a different explanation of this. And here, following Vasubandhu's lead, Manchuk Dorje presents the position of the Darshtantika. Now, the Darshtantika school is like a predecessor of the Sutra school. Sometimes the name Darshtantika is used to refer to the Sutra school. Historically, they actually were a little bit beforehand. They're maybe not fully developed positions of the Sutra school. Of course, it's not so there are no actual scriptures of the Sutra school have survived, except for one that's in Chinese. And that was even written by a mind-only master. So it's hard to say what actually the positions of the Sutra school really were, according to the Sutra school. But there were the Darshtantikas who were their predecessors. So the Darshtantikas do not assert pleasure born of cognition, and so present only bodily pleasure as a branch. So they say that the pleasure on the first three dhyanas is bodily pleasure. It's not pliancy called by the name pleasure. In other words, the great expositions say that it's pliancy, you're just calling it pleasure. And the Darshtantikas say, no, it's not. And the reason they give is that then there wouldn't be any difference between that. If it's pliancy, what makes it different from the pliancy of the fourth jhana? That's one of the branches of the fourth. As it says here, otherwise it would follow that the pliancy of the fourth jhana would be pleasure. But the pliancy of the fourth jhana is not. It is not pleasure, because in the fourth jhana there's only a neutral feeling. So if one needs a pliancy that is compatible with the feeling of pleasure, then it follows that the pliancy of the third would also be that. As it also says in a sutra, at the time the noble listeners have manifested through their bodies the pleasure born from complete withdrawal and perfected it, dwelling within it, at that time the five dharmas of this are discarded. The meditation of the five dharmas, great serenity, joy, pliancy, pleasure, and samadhi is completely perfected. So, so this is discussing the third dhyana with the great serenity, joy, pliancy, pleasure, and the meditation of the five dharmas of the five dhyanas. So here, pliancy and pleasure are said to be separate, so that would be contradicted. So this is what they're saying here. They're giving this on the fourth jhana, on the third jhana, excuse me. So that's basically the positions. There are these different positions, and there's a lot of description of the back and forth between them. But the main point is that according to the great exposition tradition, we're talking about that workability of the body as the faculty of pleasure, and the joy as mental pleasure. And then you've got a slightly different quality of pleasure. It's not physical pleasure, it's not mental pleasure, they call it cognitive pleasure, and that's the pleasure on the third dhyana. And so now we've come to the topic on explaining complete serenity in particular. So serenity here in Sanskrit, this is called prasada, and in Tibetan it's raptudangwa. So prasada or raptudangwa, or serenity. So literally, raptudangwa does mean like complete purity, lucidity, very clear, and undisturbed. So it's also got that quality of serenity. If you look at in the dictionary at the definitions or the translations offered for the Sanskrit word, it has both connotations of serenity and serenity and purity. It's kind of like, I think that when you're really serene, there's kind of a pure aspect to it. And I think that sort of purity of not being disturbed is also serene. So what is that? Serenity is faith. So that quality of raptudangwa. In fact, actually, back in the second chapter, when it asks, says, what is faith? Faith is dangwa. It's that same quality of dangwa or raptudangwa. The clarity or the sincerity is of mind, that is faith. So here, in the context of jhana, when we're talking about the serenity of the third jhana, this is faith. The faith of conviction, of knowing, seeing. It's not, we've talked about this, so there are different types of faith: faith of longing, faith of pure, sincere faith, and the faith of conviction. And here, this is the faith of conviction. True inner serenity is confident faith, the faith of believing that having attained the second jhana, one is emancipated from the first jhana. So you know you're on the second jhana. You know that you have eliminated that, and so that is that. So, and then there are also the distinctions of mental pleasure, and as it says here, and two scriptures say joy is mental pleasure. So there are two citations that say that the faculty of joy is mental pleasure. So some other schools say that joy is a different mental factor, and mental pleasure is taught as the branch of pleasure of all three jhanas, they say. And so this is actually, in particular, it is talking about the Theravada school. The present-day Theravada school in their Abhidharma actually teach it like this. And they talk about two different qualities, which in Sanskrit are called piti and sukha. So piti is what we translate in Tibetan as gawa, and into English I translate as joy. They translate it differently. Many people translate it as rapture, and others translate it as zest, rapture or zest. They give kind of different grades of it. Here from the Theravada Abhidharma, they say that there are 5 grades of piti that arise when developing concentration. Minor zest, momentary zest, showering zest, uplifting zest, and pervading zest. So like these different qualities. So they say that it's actually a different mental factor that is in the aggregate of formations. It is not in the aggregate of feeling. Happiness or pleasure, this translator translated it as happiness rather than pleasure, which is one difference. They say it is a pleasant mental feeling. They specifically say it is a mental feeling. So it is identical with joy, they say. And it is not the pleasant bodily feeling that accompanies a body consciousness. So sometimes it's also called bliss and so forth, or they can also be translated as bliss, they say. So basically, when we're talking about a school that says that joy is a different mental factor and mental pleasure is the branch of pleasure of all the first 3 dhyanas, then that would be the Theravada school. But Vasubandhu and then Wanchak Dorje says this is not the case, because if it were so, it would contradict two scriptures. And so the first of these is the Viparita Sutra. So in the Viparita Sutra, after saying the 3rd dhyana, the Bhagavan says, on this, that is on the 3rd dhyana, the rising of all faculties of mental pleasure without exception cease. So here the Buddha is saying that on the 3rd dhyana there is no mental pleasure. That's why they have to call it cognitive pleasure in the Great Exposition. Also, it says, on the 4th dhyana, all faculties of pleasure without exception cease. So basically, this means that on the 3rd dhyana, you don't have mental pleasure, but you do have a faculty of pleasure. Then on the 4th dhyana, all faculties of pleasure without exception cease. So that means that that is the reason why the Great Exposition says that there is a different type of pleasure called cognitive pleasure on the 3rd dhyana that is actually considered more the bodily pleasure than the mental pleasure. There also another quote. It's from the sutra which teaches the branches of dhyana. It says, and pleasure is also discarded. Previously, suffering has also been discarded, and mental pleasure and mental suffering have also previously disappeared. So this is talking about going from the 3rd to the 4th jhana. It says that at that point, you're discarding pleasure. But before that, you had already eliminated mental pleasure and mental suffering. Mental pleasure, you discarded when going from the 2nd dhyana to the 3rd dhyana, and mental suffering when you achieved the dhyanas in first. So therefore, it says, because it would not be proven that mental pleasure had previously been discarded, on the 3rd dhyana there can be no faculty of mental pleasure. Therefore, the joy of the first 2 dhyanas is only mental pleasure and is not pleasure, not physical pleasure. So those are the distinctions of the distinctions of those 3 branches. And this is probably the most complicated area of this chapter. So now we've come to the distinctions between the absorptions. So this has three topics: the distinctions between the afflicted and unafflicted, the features of the 4th dhyana, and the distinctions in feeling between causal and resultant absorptions. So the distinctions between the afflicted and the unafflicted, well, this is talking about which branches are absent in the afflicted absorptions. So in the afflicted, there is no joy or pleasure. That's on the 1st jhana. You're in the afflicted. You're in the 1st jhana. If it's afflicted, then there's no joy or pleasure because you're afflicted. On the 2nd jhana, there's no serenity because your mind is stirred up. So how can it be serene or pure? On the 3rd jhana, there's no awareness or mindfulness. And on the 4th jhana, there's no equanimity or pure mindfulness. Some also say that on that 4th jhana, there's no pliancy and no equanimity. So are these same branches previously explained also present in afflicted dhyana, you ask? So this is the question that leads up to this verse. It says, they are not. So basically, when you have afflicted, you don't have the full dhyana. It's not got all the branches. So which of them are not present, you ask? In the afflicted first jhana, there is no joy or pleasure born of withdrawal, that is, withdrawal from the desire realm, because it is not withdrawn from the afflictions of that is its own level, the first jhana. It's still got the afflictions of the afflictions of the first jhana are manifest, and so at that point, it doesn't have joy or pleasure. On the second jhana, there is no great serenity because it is sullied by the afflictions of its own level. It's like the old afflictions come up, they stir things up, so it's no longer serene or pure. On the third jhana, there is no awareness or mindfulness. Remembering mindfulness is remembering the equanimity, and then awareness is remembering to be mindful, because it has been, the reason why is because it has been made completely diluted by afflicted pleasure. You have that afflicted pleasure, this kind of enjoying things. And so instead of remembering the equanimity, you're remembering your pleasure. And on the fourth jhana, when you have afflictions, there is no equanimity or pure mindfulness because those two have been stained by the afflictions. So some say there is no pliancy on the afflicted first or second jhana, and on the third and fourth there is no equanimity because these are virtuous major grounds. So the mental factors of pliancy and equanimity are virtuous. So they can only happen when the virtuous when there's a virtuous cognition. When you have an afflicted cognition, the virtuous mental factors are not present. So therefore, the pliancy on the afflicted first and dhyana. So that would be what we refer to as pleasure on the first and second dhyana. And on the third and fourth, there's no equanimity, since those are virtuous major grounds. So the virtuous major grounds means the class of virtuous causal mental factors. So the features of the fourth jhana. The fourth is free of the 8 faults, so it's immovable. They are considering, examining, breadths, and pleasure, and the other 3. So the fourth is free from 8 faults. What are these 8 faults? And because it's free from that, it's called immovable. It can't be moved around. It's like free of the problems. And so the faults are considering, examining, and then the breaths is plural, meaning that it's the in-breath and the out-breath. And then pleasure and the other 3. So as it says in the commentary, the Bhagavan has said, because the 3 jhanas have faults, they are movable. They're not stable. The fourth jhana is immovable, it's stable. The fourth jhana is free from 8 faults, explained below, so it is immovable. And so what are these 8 faults? The 8 faults are considering, examining, the in-breath and the out-breath, being very specific. Yashomitra has a comment here. The reason why the word breaths appears in the plural, actually in the Tibetan, in the Sanskrit appears in the dual number. The reason why it appears in the dual number is to indicate that there are 2, the in-breath and the out-breath, he says. And then the pleasure and the other 3, which are suffering, mental pleasure, and mental happiness. So these are basically saying that you don't have, of the 5 different types of feeling, the only feeling you have is neutral feeling. You don't have pleasure or mental pleasure, or the physical suffering, physical pain, or mental unhappiness or mental pain. So you only have the feeling of that. So for that, the feeling of neutral, so it's a more stable. Those are all faults. So then what is the distinction in feeling between the causal and the resultant absorptions? Now, the causal absorptions are the absorptions that you do on a lower level, such as in the desire realm. And then the resultant absorptions are the absorption that you have when you are reborn in the form or formless realm. Or excuse me, actually, in particular, we're talking about the form realm, because all the formless realms have the same neutral feeling. So the dhyanas of birth have happiness and pleasure and the neutral feeling. Neutral and happiness, and pleasure and neutral and the neutral feeling. So here he's going through the faculties of pleasure that are on each of the 4 jhanas. So on the first jhana, you have happiness, pleasure, and the neutral feeling. So that's physical happiness, mental pleasure, and neutral feeling in the birth. On the second jhana, you have the neutral feeling and happiness, but you don't have the physical pleasure because there's no body consciousness on the second jhana. And the third, you have, on the third jhana, you have the pleasure and neutral. So that's mental pleasure again. And on the fourth, you only have neutral feelings. So to read the commentary, are those feelings that are in the causal jhanas of absorption also present in the resultant jhanas of birth, you ask? So the first jhanas of birth have happiness in the level of mind consciousness and the pleasure of the three consciousnesses, and neutral feeling of four consciousnesses. So this means when you are born into the level of form of the first jhana, so the level of great Brahma's ministers, and Brahma's abode. When you're born in those three levels, then you have mental pleasure, that's the mental happiness, that's happiness here, and also pleasure of the three consciousnesses. Three consciousnesses here means the three sensory consciousnesses that work on the level of form. So those are the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, and the body consciousness. The tongue consciousness and the nose consciousness do not operate on the level of form, in the form realm. And the reason for that is that in the form realm, that those are primarily, the main use for those is looking for and enjoying food, right? That's why, like your dog sniffing for food, or if, we're smelling the coffee or whatever. So when you're free of desire for the desire realm, you are freed of desire for food. And then you no longer have any need for a taste consciousness or for a nose consciousness. And so therefore, there are none of those consciousnesses. So you have three sensory consciousnesses on the level of the first level of form, which would be the eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and body consciousness. So you have those three consciousnesses. So you have mental happiness in the mental consciousness, the pleasure, the physical pleasure of the three consciousnesses, and the neutral feeling of the four consciousnesses. That is the mental consciousness plus the eye, ear, and body consciousnesses. On the second jhana, there are both neutral and mental happiness, but there is no physical happiness, no physical pleasure on the second jhana. And the reason for that is because there is no considering or examining, and the sensory faculties require considering and examining to engage their object. So therefore, there is no there are no sensory consciousness, and therefore no physical or bodily pleasure on the second, third, or fourth jhanas. And on the third, there's also pleasure and neutral. So there's that cognitive pleasure we've mentioned about, and neutral feeling. On the fourth jhana, there is only neutral feeling. So here, when we're talking about it, the question of these is, so in the commentary here it says, of these, the pleasures of the first jhana is solely bodily feeling supported by the eye, ear, and body. And its neutral feeling can be both bodily and mental. From the second dhyana and above, they are all only mental feelings. And the reason is, as I just mentioned, bodily feeling is always accompanied by considering and examining. In other words, anytime you have a sensory consciousness, you have considering and examining. And because there is no considering and examining on the second level or second dhyana or above, there can be no bodily feelings either. So that is the reason why there are no bodily feelings in the second, third, or fourth jhana, or if not to mention in the formless realms. But here there's a question. Wait a minute. In the form realm, it's the form realm. So what's the good of being on the third or fourth jhana and being in the form realm if you can't perceive forms? How do you hear and see and do things? How can you act in the form realm if you don't have the sensory consciousnesses? So this is what this topic is about, dispelling a doubt. On the second and so forth, the body, eye, and ear consciousnesses and what makes them perceive is of the first. It's neutral. It is not afflicted. So when you're on the second, third, or fourth dhyana, and particularly in the when you've taken the resultant absorption of being reborn there, when you want to use your eyes and ears and so forth, when you arise from meditation and you want to have a look around, then you have to actually manifest the mind of the first jhana, and then and so you have that, and also what makes them perceive. That is the considering, examining of the first of the first jhana, and in that way, you use the consciousnesses, the sensory consciousnesses of the first jhana, and that is a neutral conscious and is not afflicted. So on the second dhyana, etc., if there is no considering and examination, how can they hear, or see, hear, or touch? And how is the act of knowing motivated? So those who are born there are not without eye consciousness and so forth. However, they are not of their own level. In other words, when you are born on the higher levels of jhanas, your eye consciousness and your ear and body consciousness are actually on the first level of dhyana. So on the second dhyana and so forth, the third, and that is the third and fourth dhyanas, the body consciousness, eye consciousness, and ear consciousnesses, and that which is the considering and examining that makes them perceive, is only manifested through those of the first jhana. In other words, you're on the second and third or fourth jhana, you arise from meditation, you want to know something through your senses, and so you enter the sensory consciousnesses of the first jhana. So that consciousness on the second, third, or fourth jhana and higher jhana is unobscured neutral because it is detached. It is also not afflicted, but it is inferior. Because it is inferior, it is also not pure absorption. That's a second conscious. So basically it's saying that it's kind of like the mind of emanations that we spoke about in the end of the last chapter. You go from your meditation into this consciousness that can then allow you, or this state, into a consciousness that allows you to then manifest the sensory consciousness of the first jhana, and then you perceive. And then when you want to go back into meditation, that consciousness of the first jhana then ceases. So where are we? Well, maybe this is a good spot to stop for today. So let's stop the share. Let's see, I have a question or two. One of those I think I have already addressed. Okay, there's a participant has also given us a link on the research into meditation, in particular in the Tummo meditation. So those aren't questions that are quite that I need to address right now. If you're interested in reading more about that, I probably should have looked online this morning to find to find that study again and tell you more about it. But I don't know, got lazy. At any rate, here we are at the for the end of today. Now, I mentioned yesterday that there was a possibility we might not have class on Tuesday, but that is not the case. We will have class on Tuesday next week, so we will continue with our regular schedule, and we will finish sometime next week, and I'm hoping to try to finish on a auspicious day. Not one with bad elemental. I've spent enough time around Tibetans that I know we have to look at these astrological connections well because of the interdependence of the outer, inner, and other. And so we need to make sure that the elemental connections work well. So we'll find a good day to end next week. Okay. So unless anyone else has any other questions, we will recite the dedication prayer. So please think to yourselves that we are dedicating the merit of teaching and listening to the Dharma today to the benefit of all sentient beings, so that we may all achieve enlightenment and be freed from the suffering of the rivers of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Osanam de tamje se pani tobne nye peranam pamchete kegana chi balong trombai si petole drokun yodrosho By this merit may we attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, and free all beings swiftly from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Chanchup semcho rinpoche ma ke panam ke jure chi che ba nyamba me bar yang gong ne gong du pelwar sho. May bodhicitta great and precious arise in those who have not roused it, never weakening in those who have. May it grow ever stronger and stronger. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Kempo.